Hello everyone and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Shin Messier and this is part 3 of my ongoing series on reflector or reflex gun sights. In the last two parts we looked at regular and gyro-controlled gun sights for aircraft, while today we'll be looking at the reflex sights most people are familiar with today, those designed to be mounted on small arms. Now, before we get started, I do need to give a huge shout out to friends of the channel Quinn Martin and Matt Moropoulos, who provided all of the sights that we will be covering in this and the next video. I really can't thank you enough, guys. Finding these fantastic boxes full of goodies in the mail was just a fantastic surprise. Now, also, since there are so many different gun sights out there on the market, both today and historically, I'll be mostly sticking to the specific histories of the sights that I had access to here, only mentioning others if they happen to be particularly relevant to the story I'm telling. And finally, because I have so many sights to show you here, I'm going to be dividing this video into two parts. The first covering gun sight development from 1900 to around 1970, and the second part 1970 to the present day. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, as previously mentioned, the first reflex sight was patented all the way back in 1900 by Irish inventor Sir Howard Grubb. His design consisted of a tube with a curved glass at the front and a flat angled glass at the rear, the bottom of which was silvered. There was also a third glass at the top, opaque with a sighting reticle etched into it. Sunlight entered through the reticle etching in the top glass, then reflected off the silvered section of the rear glass onto the rear of the front curved glass, which collimated the reticle image and transmitted it through the clear section of the rear glass, which also allowed the shooter to see through the sight itself to the target. Now, despite the fact that Grubb's design was remarkably similar to modern red dot gun sights, the fact that it could only be used in direct sunlight and that artificial light source is compact, lightweight, and powerful enough for this application wouldn't become available for another couple of decades meant that it really never caught on. And indeed, the vast majority of the reflector gun sights used during the First and Second World Wars were very large, bulky, electrically powered units for use on aircraft or artillery pieces. However, there were a number of exceptions, including this: the American T90 optical reflector sight, designed for use on the M9 Bazooka anti-tank rocket launcher. Now, unfortunately, I don't happen to have an example of the M9 Bazooka, but I do happen to have an example of the later M20 Super Bazooka, courtesy of one of my good friends. Ta-da! Now, Ian over on Forgotten Weapons has full videos breaking down the development of the M9 and the M20, but very briefly, the original M1 Bazooka, introduced in 1943, had wooden furniture and used batteries to fire the igniters on its rocket projectiles. However, the system quickly proved temperamental, with the batteries quickly running down or corroding under combat conditions. So in the M9, they were replaced by a more reliable dynamo powered by a squeeze trigger. The barrel was also strengthened and wooden furniture replaced with metal. Then, the M9A1 introduced a bayonet joint to allow the launcher to be broken into two sections for easier transport, especially by airborne troops. Finally, near the end of the war, the projectile and barrel diameter was increased from 2.36 to 3.5 inches to create the M20 Super Bazooka, which was used throughout the Korean War and the early stages of the Vietnam War. Now, early versions of the M9 Bazooka were fitted with the T43 ladder sight, but starting in September 1944, this was gradually replaced by the T90, which was designed and manufactured by none other than the Polaroid Corporation. This is designed to be mounted to the left side of the launcher via this threaded stud so that the sight can be folded away when not in use. It can also be rotated vertically to compensate for ballistic drop at longer ranges, with the range being indicated by this pointer on a matching graduated range plate. Now, this T90 is specifically designed for the M9 Bazooka and indeed is specifically marked 2.36 inches. The mounting stud is thus too small to fit the M20 and the pointer does not align with the range scale, but you get the idea. Now, if we open up this protective cover, we find a dome-shaped semi-silvered reflector, while on the back we have a mirrored reticle printed on a flat glass plate. Light passes through the front of the domed reflector, reflects off the reticle back into the rear of the dome reflector, which collimates the light rays and passes them back into the shooter's eye. The reflector being semi-silvered allows the shooter to see through it and the collimated reticle image to be superimposed over the target. Now, there were three different reticle styles provided for the T90. This is the early D31440 spiderweb version, which has concentric rings for leading a target traveling at, inside to outside, 10, 20, 30, and 40 miles per hour. The later D7162890 reticle was similar but had a more oval shape. Finally, the D7141999 reticle, mainly used on the M20 Super Bazooka, was of the ladder or tree type and had 5 horizontal lines for shooting at targets at ranges of 0, 100, 200, 300, and 400 yards. When engaging targets at longer ranges, the shooter rotated the sight back on its range plate and used the 0-yard aiming line. Each line was further divided into 6 segments, 3 each for a target moving left to right and right to left, the ends of which were used to lead targets traveling at, inside to outside, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30 miles per hour. So yes, reflector gun sights were technically used on small arms during the Second World War, though I would argue that a bazooka really stretches the definition of small arms. Despite what video games would have you believe, they were not used on smaller infantry weapons such as rifles or submachine guns. Sorry, just didn't happen. However, the very end of the Second World War did see the release of the first commercially successful civilian reflector gun sight. This is the Nydar 47, patented by Clinton S. Davis and introduced by the Swain Nelson Company, or SNC, of Glenview, Illinois in 1945. This was mainly marketed for use on shotguns for bird hunting, which makes a lot of sense since, like aerial combat, fouling involves a great deal of deflection shooting and requires the shooter to keep both eyes open in order to track targets. And indeed, it appears that at least a few of these were acquired by the US Army Air Forces very late in the war and mounted to shotguns like the Remington Model 11 to help train aerial gunners. Overall, this is very similar in design to the T90 Bazooka Sight, but reconfigured to allow for greater eye relief and field of view and better visibility in low light. Light enters this prism at the rear, reflects off the white painted reticle image at the bottom, and is projected onto this curved semi-silvered reflector at the front, which collimates the image and reflects it into the shooter's eye. Now, as most shotguns at the time weren't fitted with rails for mounting optics, you had to drill and tap your own holes in the top of the receiver to mount the Nydar. The Nydar could also be adjusted for windage by loosening this screw at the front and swiveling the top plate side to side, and for elevation by threading this large screw in the middle in and out. Now, while reportedly these did work well enough, they were also rather fragile, difficult to zero, and didn't work all that well in low lighting conditions. So while enough of these were sold that they commonly show up on the collector's market, ultimately they were never as popular as red dot gun sights would eventually become several decades later. Right, now fast forwarding 4 decades, we have the Armson Occluded Eye Gun Sight, or OEG. And this is a bit different from the other sights I have here because you actually can't see the target through it. Rather, if you look into it, all you see is a collimated red dot against a black background. The idea was that you would keep both eyes open while aiming so that your dominant eye's image of the aiming dot would be superimposed over your non-dominant eye's view of the target. And this handily solves one of the basic problems with early reflector gun sights, which is maintaining adequate contrast between the aiming dot and the target. As we'll see, other sights of this period took a different approach by adding polarizing filters over the lens to darken the image of the target relative to the aiming dot. Now, this particular model was introduced in 1981 by Armson Incorporated of South Africa, but to understand where this basic design came from, we need to go back more than a decade to 1969. Now, occluded eye sights are even older than this, with the US Army fielding the M4 collimator sight for 60 and 80mm mortars during the Second World War. However, this was illuminated by a light bulb powered by batteries, which tended to run down quickly. Now, that's not much of a problem for a mortar team, which can carry a whole bunch of bulky and heavy equipment, but for many years this was considered unacceptable for an ordinary rifleman. However, in 1969, Swedish inventor Nils Rude patented an OEG that used a transparent or translucent plastic light dome and a red plastic fiber optic element to collect ambient light and convert it into a collimated red aiming dot. These were first manufactured and sold by Normark in Sweden and Singlepoint in England, and thus widely became known as Singlepoint OEGs. Now, the Singlepoint was initially sold as a civilian product, originally retailing for $49.50 or around $300 today, but it soon saw military use when 77 units were purchased by U.S. Special Forces for use in Operation Ivory Coast, the November 21, 1970 raid to free American prisoners at the Son Tay POW camp in North Vietnam. The 150-man raiding party was originally to be issued with proper night vision scopes and goggles like the ANPVS-2 and SU-50, but only a handful of units could be delivered in time, and the single points were acquired as a stopgap measure. Now, the single point sights used during the raid were day-night models that used a radioluminescent tritium vial to eliminate the reticle in darkness. These were restricted to military and police use, with the commercial single point sights being meant for daylight use only. Indeed, quite a few advanced pieces of kit were used during this raid, and to learn more about these and the fascinating history of night vision technology, please check out my previous videos on the Metascope Type B, AN-PVS-2, PVS-502, NV-5151, and the AN-PRR-9 helmet radio. I also have a video on tritium lights and the history of radioluminescent materials, links in the description. Now, despite the Santé camp being empty at the time, the raid was near flawlessly executed and provided the raiders with useful information on the advanced gear they were combat testing. Now, the Singlepoint sights were found to be quite useful for close quarters fighting at night, though they did suffer from a number of serious drawbacks. For example, being civilian pieces of kit, they were rather fragile, with many of the raiders having to secure their sights to their rifles using copious amounts of electrical tape. The aiming dot was also very large by modern standards, a whopping 16 minutes of arc, making more distant targets difficult to engage. And one of the fundamental problems with OEGs overall is, ironically, parallax, since the image of the dot is offset from the image of the target by the distance between the shooter's eyes, meaning you actually have to compensate slightly for that offset. So for these and other reasons, the single point was not found to be adequate for combat use, and it would be another couple of decades before the US military officially adopted a reflex sight. Nonetheless, single-point OEGs were used in small numbers by elements of the British Armed Forces, particularly in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and by Rhodesia. And if you're a fan of classic 1970s movies, you might recall that a single point appears in 1978's The Wild Geese, mounted to a modified L1A1 self-loading rifle, or SLR, and, more famously, 1977 Star Wars mounted to the Rebels' Blastech DH-17s, themselves based on the Sterling submachine gun. Now, in 1973, the original single-point model with the dome-shaped light collector was replaced by the 220 series with a cone-shaped collector. By this time, the price had dropped from $50 to $25, only around $190 today. And in addition to the standard models for use on rifles and airguns, Singlepoint also offered a number of versions specifically for use on shotguns, the SP-270, 275, 276, and 280, and all these continued to be sold until around 1985. Now, the Armson OEG, like this one here, was introduced in 1981 and is a close copy of the original Singlepoint, the main difference being the overall shape and the elevation and windage adjustment knobs being mounted at the front rather than the middle of the tube. Now, this disassembles using a spring clip, but since this unit is on loan, I don't want to risk damaging it. But if we look at the original Niels Rude patent, we see that inside is a long fiber optic element, which Rude describes as being made of a PMMA polymer called Perspex 451 Red, which is fluorescent and by converting ultraviolet light into visible light, acts as a mild light amplifier. This is hinged along two axes at the rear of the sight using a ball joint, and when you turn the elevation and windage knobs, you extend or retract screws that tilt the whole fiber optic element up and down or side to side. One last neat little thing worth mentioning here is that Rude's original patent also describes a battery-powered version of this sight, and in order to preserve battery life, this integrates a mercury tilt switch that keeps the light bulb turned off until the shooter raises the weapon to the firing position, which is a neat little feature. Also contemporary to the original Singlepoint was the battery-powered Oxford Lightning sight, introduced by the Oxford Corporation of Williamsville, New York in 1969. Like many other commercial collimator sights, the Oxford was extensively tested by the US Army at Frankfurt Arsenal until 1975, but ultimately found to be too fragile for combat use and never officially adopted. Now, another contemporary of the Singlepoint was the Qwikpoint, introduced by the W.R. Weaver Company of El Paso, Texas in 1971. Based on a 1970 patent by William F. Steck, the upper section of this sight is nearly identical to the Singlepoint, with the same light-gathering dome and fiber optic filament and elevation windage knob system. However, this is not an OEG. Rather, the collimated aiming dot image is reflected off a mirror and then an angled beam splitter, allowing the shooter to actually see through the sight and the dot superimposed over the target. And you'll notice the blue tint on this beam splitter, which serves to increase the contrast between the target image and the aiming dot. Now, there are three main versions of the Qwikpoint offered. The S1, like this one, was designed to fit most pump action and semi-auto shotguns, though you had to drill and tap your own holes for the mounting rails on the 45-degree surface on the left side of the receiver. This S1100 variant, however, was specifically designed to fit the Remington 870 and 1100 and had a flat mounting plate that was secured using the existing trigger assembly pins. Meanwhile, the R1, like this one, had a Weaver mounting rail for use on centerfire rifles, while the R22 had tip-off style rails for rimfire rifles. And that brings us neatly to the state-of-the-art in reflector gun sight design circa 1970, and I think that's a pretty good place to stop for now. In the fourth and hopefully final part of this series, we'll be looking at reflector gun sight design from 1970 until the present day. Until then, thank you so much for watching. I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.